With us. Okay, thank you. With us this evening, we're glad to have Dr. Monica Smith. And she is a clinically trained social worker with a broad background from child welfare to higher education. She is currently Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Augustina College. She's very active on the board of directors on a number of organizations in the Quad City region. And she is also on the advisory council for Roots of Justice. And as you can see, I've got the Roots of Justice thing here. This work right now is sponsored by, is brought to you by Roots of Justice. We also have Dr. Tobin Miller Shearer. He is the co-founder of Roots of Justice, along with Dr. Regina Shan-Stolzfus. He currently is a history professor at the University of Montana. He also directs the African American History program at the University of Montana. His most recent book, he has about 6 books out there, but his most recent book is a book that he co-authored with Dr. Stolzfus. It's called Been in the Struggle: Pursuing an Anti-Racist Spirituality. He also likes to bake and eat pie. He thought that was really important for y'all to know. We also have Dr. Drick Boyd with us. He is also an author and professor emeritus of urban studies at Eastern University. And his most recent book is Disrupting Whiteness: Talking with White People About Racism. We are glad to have all 3 of those scholars here with us tonight as we try to make sense of this fight to erase white history. We're going to hear first from Dr. Monica Smith.
So thank you so much, Thulani. And make sense of this is indeed our goal for the night. There's been so much discussion, so much talking, so much of a narrative that is around critical race theory that those of us who are connected with Roots of Justice felt like something needs to be said about this. And we need to recognize that the attempts to silence critical race theory is really an attempt at erasing white history. The mission and the ultimate goal of Roots of Justice is providing anti-racist strategies and tools for educating, organizing, and renewing persons and institutions and systems for liberation. And so this conversation that is sponsored by Roots of Justice is a very opportune one right now. It is very appropriate to be having this conversation in the context of the mission of Roots of Justice, but also just in the context of where we are as a nation. Because the aim of Roots of Justice is to educate and to reconcile our history and healing and truth-telling, we know that this is the only way to move forward. And so tonight, though these are our building blocks, these are our pillars: education, reconciliation, healing, and ultimately truth-telling. We're going to kick tonight off with a short video. And on the other side of that video, you'll hear from my esteemed colleague, Dr. Tobin Shearer.
The video we were about to watch is a Virginia politician named Amanda Chase. And we did test that video just a few minutes ago before we came on, and we seem to be having a few technical difficulties now. We're going to give it another second and try one more time.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I have a new update here, and this one actually has to do with an announcement that Mayor Stoney just made. Mayor Stoney has basically come out and said he's looking to remove all of our Confederate monuments. You know, I've spoken advocately against erasing Virginia's history. This does not belong to Mayor Stoney. It belongs to all Virginians. It is our history. Do I think we should learn from it? Absolutely. And we should add to the monuments that are there. But you know, it disturbs me whenever I see people, you know, let's be honest here. There is an overt effort here to erase all white history. I mean, that's what they're looking at doing.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen. Dr. Shearer, you have some thoughts.
All right. As we were preparing for this conversation, we all reflected on the theme that many people talk about critical race theory, but we don't always understand what it is, where it's come from, and what the controversy has been about. So what I'm going to do here in a fairly brief fashion is just give us a bit of the background, the central ideas, and then a couple quick conclusions about why it's showing up where it is and why it's showing up when it is. So some background. First of all, just to put some names in front of us of people who have contributed to developing that body of theory, which we now refer to as critical race theory. These are folks like Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Davis, Charles Lawrence, Mari Matsuda, Patricia Williams, and a host of others that have and are part of ongoing conversations. We actually don't talk about critical race theory at this point. We are much more likely to talk about critical race theories. And I'll say more about some of the sort of, not splintering, but more focused and more finite approaches that we've given to the work as it's developed. But really, the history of the critical race theory movement goes back further in time. I showed you some of the more contemporary authors, but we have to acknowledge that the ideas that they're working with come from folks out of the long Black freedom struggle, such as Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Horace W. Du Bois, Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King Jr., Black Power movement, the Chicano movements writ large. It was initiated, however, out of conversations that emerged largely within the academy among scholars who began to ask each other, okay, we had all these forward movements, decisions from Brown versus Board of Education in '54 to the '64 Civil Rights Act to the '65 Voting Rights Act, and we're not seeing the changes that we would expect from that kind of legislative action and judicial action. Why is that? We speak of Derek Bell, Alan Freeman, Richard Delgado as some of sort of the founding figures and saying, okay, building on the work of those folks I named, as well as theorists like Antonio Gramsci and Jacques Derrida, saying, okay, what is going on here? In 1989, at the first annual workshop on critical race theory, scholars gathered and began to develop a body of literature which suggests at its core that it is not accidental that we haven't seen the advances we would expect after those kind of legislative and judicial shifts, suggesting instead that white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and other forms of racialized oppression are baked into the systems of the United States from its inception. Out of that body of theory, several key ideas have emerged, but I just want to note at this juncture also that this did not become part of widespread popular discourse until September 1, 2020, when a conservative journalist and pundit, Christopher Rufo, warns the country on Fox News that critical race theory is undermining the national project as a whole. But what was he actually warning about? Well, there are at this point several key idea sets, and again, I'm just going to summarize them very quickly, that have come to embody what we know as critical race theory in terms of its scholarly engagement, not sort of the popular representation of it, but what do scholars write about when they're writing in the critical race theory field? One is the simple idea that race is a social construct. It has a history. It was put in place at particular times and particular places with particular intent, especially the intent of maintaining the idea of whiteness as the norm at the top of the racial hierarchy. And we can trace that and put it in a colonial framework and note the people who developed it, articulated it, and put it in play. When I give lectures on this topic, I simply say that the history makes very clear that race is a biological myth and a social reality, and it has a hierarchy. It was never flat in any form. So that's one idea set. The other idea set that critical race theory gives us is that racism is not an exception to the American project. It is a normal part of everyday life in the Americas, again, from its inception through to the present. We can't think of it as an aberration. It's something that's been, again, baked into the legal code and to the social structures of our country. The idea of interest convergence is a fancier term than perhaps the idea itself suggests, but this was originally articulated from Derek Bell, who said, look, if we look at the Brown versus Board of Education as a case study, he claims that the only reason this came about is there were a particular set of international and domestic interests that were serving the white community at that time, that it made more worth their while, there was convergence of interest, to overturn the separate but equal statute in Plessy versus Ferguson that had been the law of the land previously. It was not about racial egalitarianism. It served the interest of the white community at that time and that place. That's the argument behind interest convergence. Differential racialization is the idea that different groups have not only been put into racial boxes at different times and different places, but at the convenience of the white community. So there have been times and places, for example, where members of the Latinx community has been more helpful to help fill a vacuum in labor, and there's been an opening up and a liberalizing around attitudes towards that community. And that shifts and change over time. Again, critical race theory suggests this according to the needs of white supremacy, not because there's egalitarian motive behind that in the main. The more recent concepts of intersectionality and anti-essentialism also have proved helpful. Of course, intersectionality coming to us from the womanist community and suggesting that racism doesn't exist isolated from the other means of expressing privilege and oppression in our society. Traditionally, and at first, it was race, class, and gender, but we also now look at issues of ableism, at sexual orientation, and all those other intersections that come together. We can't just talk about them in isolation. They need to constantly be brought into conversation. And alongside that, the idea of anti-essentialism that simply notes we're not just one thing. We are always many things, and we're not defined just by race. We're not defined just by gender. We're not defined just by sexual orientation. And finally, the idea is that there's unique voice of color. The experiences of people of color need to be amplified, need to be brought forward, particularly in terms, as critical race theory is arguing, in the experience of legal law, the way that the modern issues of law enforcement and jurisprudence have played itself out in the history of the United States. There's a particular experience that needs to be amplified and put at the central of our conversations about the way racism works in our country. Those are the main idea sets. Of course, they've been developed. There's discussions and dynamics over time. The other thing I want to put in front of us here is simply to note that the arguments for these basic ideas come from specific historical instances. Everything from the Dred Scott case that spoke to issues of whether an enslaved African was actually a member of the United States, was a citizen, to the one-drop rule, which suggests that if one has one drop, it was originally articulated around Black identity of African-American blood, you are then Black. So this is actually determined at the state level in this country. Membership and involvement in benefits from Social Security through to union membership were dictated by race, only given to white people originally. Same with US housing benefits. Of course, the list goes on, but just simply to emphasize that theorists in the critical race theory community are drawing on specific historical examples to come to their conclusions. Criticisms that were brought towards critical race theorists prior to sort of the politicization of it, internal critics asking some questions about the skepticism of objectivity and truth that critical race theories sometimes can project, an undervaluing of the traditional liberal ideas of neutrality, equality, and fairness. That's a criticism that's been brought forward. Some concern that critical race theorists spurn the notion of objective standards of merit in academia and in public and private enterprises, and also concern that those who were giving criticism of critical race theory were sometimes accused of being racist simply because they were being critical. And that's been sort of an ongoing part of the conversation as well. The final thing I'll note as background is simply to note that once this has been politicized, what we've seen is that critical race theory is now being characterized as false, a creedal position that is fundamentally anti-American and only emerges from radical leftists and anti-white racists. The accusation that's emerged out of this political process is an attempt to indoctrinate America's children by teaching critical race theory in public schools, which uniformly across the scholarly community, the collective opinion is that's just not happening. This is a body of theory that's taught mostly in law schools. It's not taught in either elementary or high schools. And then it's been in most of the legislation that's been brought forward at the state level. Critical race theory is being characterized as any suggestion that racism is entrenched in American society, any idea that people of color continue to be oppressed because of their race, any idea that whites may harbor or act upon racist attitudes of which we're unaware, and any setting in which or discussion of whites continuing to enjoy a variety of benefits which are denied people of color, the notion of white privilege. That's a very quick Reader's Digest discussion of critical race theory. I want to offer just 4 quick conclusions out of my own discussion and analysis of it. The first is to note that the timing of this having become a political debate is consistent with and needs to be understood within the context of this country's response to the murder and torture of George Floyd and others, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement more generally. The timing is directly connected to those movements. The second is the location. So as much as this is being worked out in debates over public school curriculum, we have to understand that that's not accidental and is consistent with similar struggles that have been part of this country's discussion over public school curriculum since Brown versus Board of Education. Location is not accidental. Timing is not accidental. And then the focus is also not accidental in that it has become an expression of the debates and attempts in this country to turn the narrative away from white supremacy and this country's history of both slavery and genocide. It's a political attempt, in my opinion, to shift that away from reckoning with that past. And that's my final comment, is that the struggle, I think, is continuing over these kind of conversations simply because this country has not dealt with the legacy of slavery, the legacy of genocide, and the systemic and institutional manifestations of racism that continue today. Until we've reckoned with that, these kind of conversations and the resistance to talking about white supremacy will continue to be in front of us. That's my framing conversation. Thanks for letting me go over it so quickly.
Thank you. Thanks for framing that for us, Tobin. Dr. Shearer. Monica.
Yeah, so I absolutely love your framing of that, right? Because when we begin to kind of pick out those historic facts and we talk about these issues of power, that's how we know that critical race theory is substantive, right? You made the statement at one point that critical race theory has now become a part of a political debate and it's politicized. But And I agree with that. But I would also say that race has always been political.
Yeah.
And even from how you began to talk about the exclusion of certain groups of people, that was political, right? It was the social thought. And what we know is that social thought turns to political thought and it turns to political action, right? Our laws, that legislation that you were talking about. The difference now is, and particularly after the George Floyd murder that we all saw and were traumatized by, is that now Black and brown folks have voice. We are empowered to be able to speak against these things. And there are many allies that stand alongside of us and are calling attention to this. And that's where the debate comes in, because people are now empowered to challenge these systems. And we are absolutely seeing now what is so explicit and what previously had also been explicit, right? So those bandages are ripped off. There are a couple of other things I'll say, and then I want to, give some time for our other esteemed colleague here, Dr. Drick Boyd, just to talk about American history. The video that we watched of Amanda Chase, it was a 5-minute video, and in all fairness, we showed about a minute of it. So I want to make sure that folks have the context correctly around that. But she was talking about the removing Confederate monuments in Virginia and how that was erasing Virginia's history. And that these Confederate monuments, I think it was about the Lee statue. She said that this is all of Virginia's history. I agree with her. The difference is, right, whether we honor Lee or not depends on which side of history we were on. And so if you honor Lee as an American hero, then Lee was standing and fighting for, right? He was the epitome of who you were and what you thought America should be. Those on the other side of history, folks who look like me and Thulani and our ancestors and our children and our children's children were on the opposite side of that history. And so removing the statue of Lee isn't erasing American history, right? It's determining who is honorable in American history. And I don't think we should lose that fact. Who is honorable in American history? This whole idea of race and racism and slavery and all that came after slavery is America's first sin. And today, you and I and our children and our children's children, we are living with the residue of that. And that's why we continue to have that struggle. So what we know is that American history, the American experience, is truly a white narrative, right? And you talked about this whole idea of whiteness being normed, right? And so the history, this narrative is a white narrative and it's largely male voices. And it's so explicit that when inclusion of Black and brown and immigrant experiences and voices are included, then that American history, that narrative is threatened, right? And that's largely because historically, to be American meant to be white, right? We think about Korematsu versus the United States in 1944. And talking about sued the United States because of the Japanese, I'm going to say, internment on US soil, right? We had kinder words in our history books, but it was an internment right on the West Coast of the United States. And so we think about this whole idea of who was white. They were Japanese Americans. We think about, and Dr. Shearer mentioned Plessy versus Ferguson in 1954, that whole separate but equal policy, right? What was that separation, right? And so even now, when we talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, where is it? It's in Black History Month. It's African American history. No. That's white history. So let's include that, infuse that into American history and tell the whole story, this whole narrative, right? Rather than delineating what is American history and what is Black history, women's history, all these other sorts of things. The American narrative is one of dominance. It's one that centers European identity as American, right? and everything else as hyphenated Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Indian Americans. The list goes on, but that hyphenation signifies the historic exclusion from full participation in the American experience, access to social goods and services, access to opportunities, freedoms to live where one desires, and also understanding too that the architects of American history and the architects of our education center white American experience. And it centers this, and so that again, anyone who opposes it is seen as challenging America. And we're saying we need to be included in this. And so those who are pushing against inclusion and those who are pushing against transparency and the full narrative and the truth telling, right? That's how they want history to be told. In these rose-colored lenses of, the beautiful American story, and everything else is closeted somewhere to be pulled out during certain months, right? Or to be these side notes, right, in our history books, a footnote in our history book. But we're here to tell the truth tonight. We want to do some truth telling. And instead of rose-colored glasses, I think all of us need to have the courage to understand the literal blood, sweat, and tears, right, of that are part of American history that has always been fighting for freedom. Heck, we had soldiers who were fighting for our freedom and fighting for others on other shores and were concerned. I won't forget, and I'm going to close, I won't forget the stories that my father used to tell. He was a Korean War veteran. And my father, he was in Korea, and he said he had to be careful. He wasn't quite sure who the enemy was because they're there. He was there to fight what he called Viet Congs, but he was always worried about friendly fire because his white American soldiers, right, that were part of his, the American army, he knew that those were vicarious situations also. And he had to keep his place. And he used to tell my mother, and she used to, or I'm sorry, my mother used to tell this story about how my dad, she would have to wake my dad up because he was barking in his sleep. And he had to, sometimes their punishment, right, was to sleep outside in a foxhole. They'd had to dig these foxholes, and they would bark when they heard people coming, trying to scare off whoever that enemy was. And again, he didn't know whether that enemy was another American soldier in that proud uniform, or whether it was the enemy on those other shores. And so tonight we're here to talk about this whole situation. We're going to do some truth telling here. Let's be clear that history is neither good nor bad. It just is what it is. It's facts, and it has to be a complete narrative. And my last comment here, I'm going to quote someone, I'm not going to remember the name, but those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And it does feel like the political times that we're in right now, right, is a replication of the history that some of us on this call know and others need to know. So I'm going to silence myself there and turn this over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Drick Boyd.
Wow, Monica, you've really placed, I think, given in the short time you talked there, a wonderful picture of what true history is, what the full history is. And just to echo what you said, if we really wanted to know the fullness of white history, all the things you talked about would be very much included, because it's not a rose-colored story. It's a story with a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, a lot of horrible things done, and some great things happened in our history as well. And Tobin, thank you for the overview of CRT. Even though I've studied it, I learned a few things there in your short speech. The thing that I guess I have grappled with during this whole sort of upsurge of opposition to critical race theory and any talk about racism at all in schools is what's going on with the white people who are shouting at these meetings. And I recall a podcast or an interview that Mark Lamont Hill, who's a professor at Temple University here in Philadelphia, had with a gentleman who was at the time running in a primary to become governor of Georgia. And he obviously did not win, but he was going on and on about how he wanted to get rid of critical race theory in the schools. And Dr. Hill said, well, what is critical race theory? Can you explain what your understanding of it is? And of course, he just dodged that question all the way and went off on his rant. But I think it points to two things that stand out to me. One is that politicians have found that if they can stir people up around something like critical race theory, which no one really knows what they're talking about when they're talking about it, that fear can motivate people to do some of the things we've seen in the news and heard about. But the other thing that I think that fear taps into is historical white trauma. In the early 2000s, Joy DeGree, who's a professor at Portland State University, wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And in that book, she makes the case that the trauma that many African Americans and other peoples of color in our society experience is not something that's just because of certain things that happen in the immediate, but is something that's passed down through history. And later, in the last 10 years, people who study trauma have come to realize that trauma can actually change a person's genetic makeup such that they can pass on the vulnerability to trauma to their children and grandchildren, even though those children and grandchildren may not have any experiences. And so there's been a lot of work, particularly by an author by the name of Resmaa Menakem, about historical trauma and how it lodges itself in the body. But the other thing that Resmaa talks about in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, is that there is a different source of trauma, but a kind of trauma that white people in this country also experience, which some have called perpetrator trauma, that when you either witness or participate in brutal acts of torture and mistreatment toward people, it doesn't leave you unaffected. It actually affects you. And there's been studies, particularly of German people who took part in World War II, particularly in the persecution of the Jews and the elimination of the Jews, and how that has impacted them. And Menakem suggests that this is also going on with white people in this country. So when I look at what's going on in these school meetings and people are shouting about getting rid of books on racism, I saw recently that one school district outlawed one of Toni Morrison's books, The Bluest Eye, which is a classic. And Toni Morrison is a recognized author, world recognized. But people are shouting, what's going on? It's not something rational, but it's something that's touching deep into that trauma that white people carry around, which can only be resolved, according to Menakem, when you acknowledge the hurt and the harm that you have caused and that you feel. And so it just sort of strikes me that learning the fullness of our history is not just a political issue, but it really is a source of healing for both persons of color, BIPOC folks, as well as white people, as we come to grips with what is going on and how we need to come to terms with the fact that just when the term race comes up, that so many white people just experience anxiety. I've had occasions where I've brought stuff up and people have simply walked away or gotten angry at me because it's something that touches what psychologists or neurologists call the reptilian brain, that part of our brain that just reacts in anger and fear. This is the source of the fight, flight, and freeze response. So I think this conversation has so much potential, not only to highlight the issue, but also to understand that for all of us, there's healing that needs to take place. And until we come to terms with the fact that there are things that we must acknowledge as white people in our history, we'll continue to act in ways that are self-destructive and destructive to our overall social fabric.
So I know we have a question from the audience, but something you said, Dr. Boyd, made me think about Thomas Jefferson when he was writing, right, in the Missouri Compromise, at the time of the Missouri Compromise back in 1820. You called this, you noted a particular name for this white trauma when you said you witness or participate in brutal acts. You named there was a name for it. What did you call it?
Perpetrator trauma.
Perpetrator trauma. Fair enough. Well, I think that maybe Thomas Jefferson kind of foreshadowed that when he wrote about, this whole idea of the institution of slavery. And so when he was writing about the institution of slavery, and I'm calling it the institution of slavery because of all the social institutions that exist in the United States, education, the family, law, right? All of the institutions that exist, and there are 5 core social institutions in the United States. The only institution that was created for Black folks at that time was the institution of slavery. We could not even have our families. Our children were not our own, right? So, but here's what he said. He said, but as it is, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. And so when you're talking about that fear and the danger, right? The fear of danger, the fear of the unknown, right? He was talking about this institution of slavery. What are they going to do to us?
Mm-hmm.
Not because we had done anything and they conquered and won this battle. What are they going to do to us because of what we did to them? And that gets me to Freud. Freud's fight or flight. Those are human instincts. And so here we are, right? Jefferson afraid in this whole idea of slavery. But here's the other thing he said, and this is about the political piece. He said, I'm just going to read it again. But as it is, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale and self-preservation on the other, right? And there's that dotted line right back to what Dr. Shearer told us, right? This self-preservation and the social construct of race and the interest conversion. If we keep this is about preserving who we are as a nation, whose identity, right, forms America. And historically, that's been the white identity. And we don't want to erase that issue, that history, right? We want to tell that history.
Something about white supremacy. White supremacy is a psychological disorder. Right? I mean, that's what it is. White supremacy is a psychological disorder. However, white dominance is very real, and that's what we live with. And a number of you've mentioned, you said the word fear quite a few times, and I think that's one of the major points here. The idea that white society right now is afraid of interrupting white dominance, particularly white male dominance. And I think that in some ways, white society or some members of white society are trying to lay the groundwork for what they fear is coming. Because a number of social scientists have estimated that there is a browning of America, and that in a number of years, white people will no longer be the majority. They will become a minority. And what I think some are trying to set the stage for is continued minority rule or minority dominance or white dominance, even when they become the minority, right? So, and I think that the fight the fight against white history, because it's not a fight against Black history. This is a fight that white people don't want white history to be taught. It is just not a new thing. And so there's been a national narrative that's been pretty much a lie, right? And so the lie needs to continue. The national narrative has been a lie, and the national narrative in general, and I'm not going to go point by point by point, but the national narrative has been that America is good and that white people basically are good. And just as Dr. Monica said so eloquently a number of minutes ago, that history is not good or bad. It just is. It just, there are just facts there that you shouldn't deny. So the idea that America has always been good is again another illusion. But it feels like it's something that our teachers still need to make students believe. The imprisonment of Japanese citizens is a good example. The generation that did that has taken to nicknaming itself the greatest
generation.
Right? The greatest generation not only imprisoned Japanese people who were actually citizens of the United States. So they imprisoned Japanese and they romanticize the word. So we don't call it prison camp, we call it internment camp because it doesn't sound quite as harsh as prison. So that plays into that narrative that, well, we did some things, but they really weren't that bad. We've turned history class into a compilation of romantic stories, right, in the lower grades, where we have a class that actually masquerades as history class, but it is not. It's just a compilation of one romantic story after another about the founders and about various other things. So where do we go from here? What do we do next? Because I'm concerned that as people of color, as I'm concerned that we have relinquished the teaching of our history to systems that many of us recognize are inherently racist. The systems themselves are inherently racist in the ways that we teach history. But we've relinquished that responsibility. So is there a responsibility for white people who are concerned about their children learning the facts, and specifically for people of color? What is our responsibility to take charge of what our children are learning, and how do we do that?
So I've been thinking a lot about sort of what is the most effective path forward when we are in a situation of extreme polarization. And to be clear, the situation of polarization is the result of a political strategy that tried to find a thing, a scary thing, in this case, critical race theory, to create a wedge issue. And I'll give it to those who are playing this out. It's a pretty savvy move, because you hear the words critical race theory and it just pops up elitism, it pops up the unknown, et cetera, et cetera. Soon after this became so heavily politicized, and I think Dr. Smith is absolutely on point to note that this is not unique. The politicization of race has been present from its inception. But when it became politicized, there was a group of seminary professors who came, or rather presidents, who came out and said, we will not allow critical race theory to be taught on our campuses. Pretty sure it wasn't happening anyhow, but they made a political move. So I wrote an open letter to them and said, folks, in this case, we are part, I was referring to them all as part of the same faith community I'm a part of, Christendom. And I said, I'd like to talk with you about your decision, because I said, I find a lot of truth and helpful language and concepts that have emerged from the body of theory known as critical race theory. I'd like to talk with you about this. One of the 7 got back to me only to say, sorry, I'm not interested in the conversation. But I still am convinced that having that conversation to get to the point of fear is going to be the responsibility of those of us who are white to seek out others who are having their fear be manipulated. Frantz Fanon has this great quote, the plunge into the chasm of the past is the condition and source of freedom. And I want to find a way to be more effective to talk to my white sisters and brothers and let them know that, yeah, that is really scary. But we need to find the resilience and the strength within ourselves as white people to face that history, as Drick suggested, as a first step towards actually being able to undermine the system of white supremacy and to get ourselves out of that cycle of continue to participate in the oppression of our fellow human beings and fellow citizens. But it's going to be a conversation about finding the courage to do that.
So I want to say a couple of things, and then we've got a question from the audience that maybe we should attend to at that point. Your points are well taken, Dr. Shearer. And I think about this whole idea of, you know, having the courage and to face these fears, right? But you know, I remember sitting in classrooms in elementary school, and when we would hear history and we would see these, you know, antiquated images of Africans, and we would learn about slavery, there was no question about how we were feeling in those moments, right? As very young children. And you know what? We survived. And in the Black community, we're always talking about race. We can't show up without being racial beings. But what has happened, again, given this narrative that America and American history is white history, and it's only those really good things in American history, what has happened is that folks have been entitled, right, to not think about these other pieces. The other thing is that while it is the European voice that we hear, it is a white voice that we hear so much in so many of our systems, how Christianity should be, how the laws should be, how education should be, what makes a valid composition of a family, right? All those social systems. Because this voice is so common, we don't stop to think about how narrow the lens is. It is those of us who are outside of this whiteness that has the broader lens, and therefore this bigger scope, and better able to understand the fuller context of the American experience, the fuller context of what our history is. And we can't afford to be fearful about that. You know, Trevor Noah said a few months ago that Black women can't afford to F around and find out. We better know. We better know exactly what's going on and how to navigate society. And what I think, I'll qualify this as a Smithism, my own personal and professional opinion. But what I think is that American identity and white identity has been so steeped in fear that continues, and people still don't know what will we do if we face the facts. But there's strength in facing the facts. And just imagine, this is a rhetorical question, but just imagine if we had a very full picture of true American history, that full narrative that talked about the atrocities that occurred on this great land, but also talked about the resilience and the strength and the ability for us to come together. Who would have thought that a Black woman would be sitting here with 3 men, 2 of them who are white, when you think about our history along lines of race as well as gender? But here we are. And so it can be done, and we are proof. Again, if folks have the courage and let go of their entitlements and see the value, right, in those who have been formally excluded. And we won't be excluded. We'll continue, right, to tell this history. So, but I know we've got a couple of questions from the audience. So,
okay, am I gonna read them? Okay, I guess I can. I would love, somebody wants to understand the difference between white trauma and white supremacy.
I think Dr. Boyd, you were talking about that issue of trauma and that sort of thing. I think that question might be intended for you.
Yeah, I would distinguish white supremacy or white dominance. I think is what Thulani likes to use instead. Is an ideology that gets lived out in every everyday life, both in terms of personal interactions, but also in terms of the structures and systems that, govern our society, the laws and powers and practice. The trauma, on the other hand, is something that is in our guts, in our hearts. It's emotional. It's mostly tied to that part of the brain that responds to things out of fight or flight or freeze. It's not rational. It's entirely irrational, but it's so powerful that it governs the way we act and think, and can override those parts of our being that are more rational and can think things through. And so my bringing it up was just to highlight that it's going to be hard to have those kind of conversations that I think we need to have, that Tobin mentioned. But we need to go in aware that we're going to be doing some powerful emotions, as well as trying to deal with ideas that come out of those emotions of fear and just wanting to withdraw. So I guess that's how I would distinguish the two. I see them as complementary, but they're not. They come at the issue from two different sides.
Can I add that I think for people of color also that the trauma is not event-based, but it is chronic, unresolved racial trauma, daily, weekly, monthly, but it's chronic, unresolved racial trauma, not from things past, but daily trauma, of the trauma that we all experience by watching someone being tortured and murdered. The trauma that you go through when you go to the bank, or when you park, or my God, listen, when you live life on red alert, or you live life on yellow alert, when your blood pressure goes up when you sit in your car because you're hoping you don't see blue lights, come on, that's all of that is trauma. All of that is trauma that adds to the physical challenges that people of color face because of the chronic unresolved racial trauma that we face in many cases daily.
And you know what, Dr. Thulani, first of all, I'm excited tonight, in case nobody can tell, in case anyone can tell. But what you're saying resonates with me, as did Dr. Boyd's point. He said trauma is so strong that it governs our actions. And I think about the times that police officers say to Black men, why did you run? Trauma.
Exactly.
Why did you run? If you're not guilty, why did you run? Trauma. But again, I want to make these connections. And there is another question about how, this kind of stuff is done in relationship. And somebody is asking, how do we build those relationships? Again, if we recognize those points of interest that we have, meaning that shared experience, if we know that both, racial identities, and we know that race is a social construct, but it still functions, right, in terms of identities. If we know that both racial identities have trauma, then let's connect there and talk about that, right? Because again, it's those experiences in history that divided us, but still left us traumatized.
Right.
And so maybe that's a point of connection. We're traumatized by racism.
Right.
Again, which side you're on in terms of the experience, but the detriment is the same.
That's an excellent point. That's an excellent point.
I am also concerned about the segregation of history. I'll be brief about this, but I've had a bee in my bonnet, and white people say about this for a while, about how we do African American History Month. In fourth grade, in second grade, it's Martin Luther King, Soldier of Truth, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass. By the time you get to eighth grade, now you may be writing a paper, but Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, Frederick Douglass. And then you get to 12th grade, and again, you're doing a research paper. It's the same people, Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, Soldier of Truth, so forth and so on. And there's an unspoken message in that. The unspoken message to children of color is, this is really not important to you. If our children were doing the exact same math in 12th grade that they were doing in 4th grade, we would not stand for that. We wouldn't expect it. However, we allow the school system to treat Black History Month as though it's really not a serious thing. And so our children get an unspoken message there. The unspoken message to Black children is, this is not really important. This is something that white people have given you all to make you feel like there have been a few people in your race who have done a few significant things for y'all. That they didn't have any global impact at all, but they've done a few significant things for y'all. And the same unspoken message goes to the white children also, that this is not important at all. It's just not important at all. And we go through the usual suspects every year. So what I'm not saying is that we need to, you're not hearing Conrad say we need to get rid of Black History Month. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is what Dr. Monica said just a while ago, that this is American history. And the fact that we've segregated, and Dr. Carter Woodson in 1925 recognized that there needed to be Negro history happening. And so it started out as Negro History Week, which became Black History Month a number of years later. But just like we've kind of Santa Claused Dr. Martin Luther King, we've also Santa Claused Black history with a few usual suspects. And so that also gives me pain as we're talking about critical race theory and as we're talking about erasing white history. My pain and my anguish also is around how we've chosen to do African American History Month.
Well, and just to build on that, I think what's really tragic is those teachers who are teaching those lessons, that's about what they know.
Right.
About, in other words, our education departments in our universities that are training our teachers are not providing them with the kind of education that they need to have to really teach that history in a way that really speaks to more than just the Santa Claus nature of it. And same with parents, white parents. They don't know what they don't know, and so they're frightened about it. I had a conversation about a year ago with a man who was telling me this story about this school out in California where the parents were all up in arms because their kids were coming home and talking about the fact that they talked about race in school. And this friend of mine was saying they're traumatizing the kids. And I said, no, it's the parents who are traumatized. The kids said, no better. It's just what they're being told. And so there's a whole process of change that needs to go on in our schools of education, which is why all those presidents that you wrote, Tobin, and the lack of response you got is so troubling. It's because decisions are being made at that level just to avoid the topic altogether, when in fact, the well-being of those students that those teachers are going to teach when they get out of school is at stake.
So I wanted to pick up on a question that's showing up in our chat here. Question from Gregory Battle. We must have the conversation, but it cannot happen without a relationship. How do we engage the relationships? So one of the things I've learned over time about my own learning and commitments to the world around me is that it's really important that I be able to hold two dissimilar concepts together in my head and in my spirit and in my actions at the same time. And in our conversations, whether it's about critical race theory or about the problem of racism writ large, we have to constantly be holding together the need to work both interpersonally and institutionally at the same time. For those of us who are white, my experience has been we're way more comfortable thinking just in the interpersonal frame and not talking about the institutional dynamic. I've had conversations many different places, from bars to the classroom, with white folks who are diametrically opposed to the commitments I've made to be a part of the work of dismantling racism. I always engage those, but I also know I think I've been part of doing a lot more change by getting 3 or 4 predominantly white institutions to institute the requirement of every one of their employees to demonstrate in their annual personnel review how have they worked to disrupt white supremacy in their job. And that's had far more reaching effects than the 4 or 5 folks that have, I think, perhaps out of our ongoing relationship, made a change. But I just want to be sure, as we're thinking about personal healing, as we're thinking about collective healing, we don't just put that in a counseling framework. We don't just put that in a relational framework. We need to put it alongside and with an institutional framework. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that critical race theory does end up being such a threatening thing, is because it requires us to pay attention to the institutional and not just talk about who our friends are.
Yeah, and you know what? It also, when you put it in that context, thank you for that, because the other thing that happens is, it begins to critique all of these narratives that we have just accepted, right? That we're a meritocracy, this whole Protestant work ethic, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, that America has everything you need if you just work hard enough. It really begins to make us think about these philosophical ideas that are supposed to be, again, a part of this American institution. And once we begin critiquing these narratives, right, then we begin to unpack where some of these untruths are or half-truths are, and we still don't have this authentic, right, story. So thank you so much for that, Tobin. I'm going to read one of the comments that's in the chat, if that's okay.
Please do.
We have a comment here that says, I learned Black history in church settings, worship, Sunday school, and special programs. Black communities have to share the history. Our children are often as ignorant as non-Black children. And that, that's interesting. The part that says our children are often as ignorant as non-Black children, I'm thinking that this is a comment from a person of color, or from a Black person. And where it says Black communities have to share the history, I certainly agree with that. At the same time, the family is one of our social institutions. Children are required to go to school at the age of 5, right? And so it's our education institution that has the responsibility of teaching us. Now, we have a strong oral history. We brought that with us from the motherland. So we're gonna continue to tell that history. But it's like whisper down the lane. With each generation, pieces of the message get lost, and we can't afford that. The history that we should be telling as Black people are the history of our lineage. My grandmother, my grandfather, and he used to do this, and this is our land, and Pop had this. That's the history that we should be able to keep intact. We should not be responsible for the entire history of the Black community and the entire history of the entire American history, white history too. So I agree with you that we have to tell our own stories. At the same time, we want to hold our social institutions accountable. We want to hold our social institutions accountable, because they're going to take my taxes for these school districts the same way they take other folks' tax, and taxation without representation. I think there was a fight or something about that. So I'm making light of it at this point, but this is serious. This is serious, right? We need this whole story, and we need for it to be not additive, not integrated. It needs to be infused in the fabric, right, of this wonderful social institution that we call education, that we require folks to go to. And people are willing to mortgage their houses, right, for private schools, for higher ed. I work in higher ed, and I know what private, education, and people will mortgage their houses and take out loans to get education. But then they sit in these college classrooms, and there's all this unlearning that they have to do, because there's so much that they don't know when we start to critique the canons, or we start introducing them, right, to Black and brown voices. They don't want to believe it. Why? Because why didn't I hear about it before?
Right.
Right? So we are still cleaning up, right, this spilled milk, the spilled blood, right? Trying to make sure that the narrative is tight, and that it's true. So
as professors, when you get students who come in and they know damn near nothing about the history of people of color here, how do you navigate that? How does that make you feel?
I'm going to put my colleague, Dr. Boyd, on the spot here. We both taught at Eastern University in Pennsylvania, and we both taught, of course, Justice in a Pluralistic Society, the exact same curriculum, the exact same assignments, the exact timeline. There were probably 8 of us or more who taught this class, and every semester, the Black faculty who taught this information would get shredded in our reviews. Don't take this professor, they're rigid, they're mean, they don't like my work, whatever. You make up your own language about it without even having sat in the class. That's what we got. And Dr. Boyd,
Yeah,
what kind of singing of your praises did you get?
well, it's interesting you tell, because there was a adjunct, in fact, the African-American pastor actually, who taught, either taught just that course just before me or just after me. And we would get together just to compare notes. And what he shared with me is very much along the lines of what you just said, that he was just getting all sorts of pushback, which I never did. But to the question of what I taught, I actually borrowed something I learned in Roots of Justice, actually, when it was called Damascus Road, because you had this paper all across the wall, and you had this timeline, and I had people work on the timeline to get a sense of the whole scope. As opposed to getting pushback, I think for some students, I think it was kind of eye-opening, but for other students, it was just something they had to get through. I mean, I had many heated conversations with individual students who thought I was trying to make them feel guilty or trying to push something down their throat. And I would respond, so what are you afraid of? You know, what is it that's you're talking about here? It's not about the information, it's about something that's deeper. But it didn't affect my evaluations like Monica shared. And certainly my colleague, who I often compared notes with, we would be teaching the exact same thing. And it didn't necessarily have to bear on race. It was just the fact that he was an African-American man pushing something about social justice, at least in their minds, teaching something about social justice they perceived as pushing down their throat, that he really struggled. So I just want to say that my limited experience is that what you shared was very true, very true.
And I'll just give a shout out to my colleague, David Evans at Eastern Mennonite University. He and I have co-authored an article where we think through both the social and racial positioning of ourselves as instructors and our classes. And we developed sort of a theoretical framework for how we walk with students through that process. And one of the most central ideas is that part of our job as instructors in the very kind of environment that you described, Thulani, is to put our students in the position of creative dislocation. And we both teach in predominantly white institutions. And that's our task, that we are going to get them in that space where they are unsettled simply by exposing them to this history and then finding strategies to help them move through that point of dislocation, that they're not stuck there. Because that's what we've observed in many classes where students can, particularly white students, get stuck in that sense of dislocation. We want to give them the cognitive and, in many instances, the emotional resources to deal with that dislocation and move to a place where they can be part of the conversation of how we respond to that history rather than avoiding or denying it.
We're gonna wrap up in a few minutes. We could go on and on and on. I'm loving this conversation, and I love this group. What do you think we can do to push back? Do you know of any organized national pushback against this against this fight to erase white history, or any local pushback. Because it seems like white people want to have it both ways. We want to claim that most white people are not racist, and that there's just a few bad apples and blah 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 blah. But it seems like the minority voices have a lot of control over what's happening in our school board meetings.
Here in Montana, we are currently under a attorney general ruling, which has a ban on critical race theory being taught in any state institution. The language of that ban, which has the force of law until it's overturned or affirmed in court, is a stereotype of critical race theory. All those sort of worst fear-mongering elements that don't really have anything to do with critical race theory at its core. I've been so pleased and encouraged by not only my faculty union here at the University of Montana, but groups like ACLU here in the state, which have pushed back very hard to say, at the minimum, within the university system, we're not going to allow that to apply because of our commitment to intellectual freedom, to academic freedom. That's just a small, tiny little slice, but I think it's those decisions being made in local communities that try to draw a line, which is going to be really important, that we are not allowing that fear mongering in order to affect how we instruct in the classroom.
Thanks, Tobin. Anyone else?
Yeah, in Pennsylvania right now, it's there are all sorts of different things being done. I mean, for instance, in the Philadelphia school system, students are required to take African-American history. That's just part of the curriculum. But you go out to some of the suburban areas, and that's where some of the fights are occurring. And so it's not, we don't have a situation like in Montana, where there's a potential law that we're going to have to contend with. So I'm not aware, but it's a great question, and if I knew of such a group, I would really want to be connected to it.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to speak generally on this. I don't want to necessarily name a particular group other than to talk about freedom of speech, right? In higher ed, there are some organizations, AAP and PEN America, that really look at freedom of speech and what you teach in your classroom, right? And particularly at liberal arts colleges, this whole critical thinking piece and preparing, when you think about the aims of higher ed too, really thinking about preparing students to be productive citizens, right? And to be marketable. And when you look at the research, employers want not only more diverse people, right? But they also want folks who have these particular skills. They're no longer soft skills. You need to understand, right, about history. You need to have this emotional intelligence, right? And so what's happening is when folks are talking about banning this and concerned about, children not being able to handle it, they should know that there are generations of folks who have handled it and continue to handle it, right? And so the exemplars are here for those children, and even those folks that can help their children, no matter how old they are, right, to deal with this, because we're still here. But the other thing I'll say is that, again, this is not a new space where we are. We've seen this. We've been through the integration of our schools. We all seen those pictures of Ruby Bridges. We've read about, Bull O'Connor's Birmingham, right? We've read Dr. King's, or maybe not read Dr. King's Why We Can't Wait. We are standing still on the shoulders of giants, and the template is there already. And truth be told, American government belongs to us. It belongs to us. The folks who are making these rules represent us. And our voices need to be just as strong now as they were before we were this free. We were less free in pushing our government to do the right thing. And so it's been done in the past. And going back to what I said earlier, that those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it, we are replicating history right now, and we ought not be silenced. And so for those who were sitting in our state, our state senators, our local government, our school board, we need to be able to push back, but we don't have to take up the language of critical race theory. Because those of us who were on this call, and hopefully some of the folks who are in the audience tonight who witnessed and who heard Dr. Shearer talk about what is critical race theory, we know that that's been weaponized. Really what we're talking about, right, is American citizenry. We're talking about diversity. We're talking about this beautiful mosaic, right, in terms of who we are as American citizens. We're talking about inclusion, right, rather than exclusion. We're talking about equity and equality, all of those things that make us who we are. And we're talking about, again, those who have always had access and rights to this, who are now very entitled and dominant. And those of us who have gained some of that access, and we won't be denied. History will not be denied. And so I think we just need to, again, have the courage that our ancestors have had, those who are gone before us and those who are still here. The template is there, the blueprint is there. We just need to be able to have the courage to continue to fight, to keep our hands on the plow, as it were, and to continue to move forward together, because the representation of Black and white and brown and Asian, all of us together, the representation together is stronger than each of us trying to fight this solo, right? And I think that our energies need to be headed in two directions. One, those who are absolutely against it, but even just as much, or maybe even more so, to those who are apathetic, right? That's where we've got to be. We've got to make our voices loud and strong, and make sure that we're making good decisions in terms of who we're voting for, what we're supporting, and not be silenced. So.
Hey, thanks so much, everybody. Dr. Monica Smith is the Vice President of Diversity, Chief Officer, Diversity Officer at Augustine College. Thank you so much, Dr. Monica Smith. Dr. Tobin Miller Shearer is at University of Montana, Missoula. A lot of Black people there in Missoula, Doctor? No. Dr. Shearer, thank you so much. Drick Boyd, thank you so much. He is Professor Emeritus at Eastern University. You've been watching production of Roots of Justice. We want to do a lot more of these kinds of things, and your support is welcome. And you can support us with your thoughts and prayers, and you can support us with your money, so that we can continue doing the work that we do. But we're going to sign off, and thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Good night.